you all again to the UNU-INWEH public event, the Science Talk. For those of you joining us for the first time, we welcome you and we're glad that you can make it today. I am your host, Professor Grace Oluwasonya. Before presenting our distinguished speaker for this morning, please note that there will be an interactive Q&A session at the end of our presentation. At that point, there will be room for comments, Q&A, and any other contribution that you may have. Please type your comments or questions in the Q&A chat box. We will pick them up from there afterwards. The topic of today is storing and managing water for the environment is more efficient than mimicking natural flows. So let's talk. Our presenter is Professor Sara Null. She is the lead in environmental water management at UNU-INWEH and Professor Watershed Sciences, Utah State University, United States of America. Our research and teaching focuses on addressing the potential to protect aquatic ecosystems while maintaining water resource benefits for people. Our research trajectories include trade-offs between human and environmental water uses, hydroclimate change and adaptation, environmental water management for saline lake preservation, to mention a few. Our work has been highlighted in many media outlets, including the New York Times, Science Magazine, National Geographic, and BBC Newsday. So, Professor Sara Null, you are very much welcome. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I'm excited to be giving this talk today to UNU. And so, like my introduction said, I'm going to be talking about a paper that was just recently published about storing and managing water for the environment. Okay, so what is environmental water management before we get started? Usually when we hear about water management, it's about managing water for cities, for industry, sometimes for farm. And I'm kind of flipping that on its head a little bit and thinking about how do we manage water for the environment? Because we do manage water for the environment, and so we want to do it explicitly, not just as slop around the edges. So a real definition is we want to address the potential to protect aquatic ecosystems while maintaining water resource benefits for people. And there's a few kind of major approaches that we use. The first is what I'd call a regulatory approach. So we might have environmental standards that are regulated, things like minimum flows or environmental flows. There's a lot of names for them, functional flows, flow shaping. Those are all ways that we could regulate environmental water. Sometimes we also use a market approach where we might institute water markets as a way to reallocate some water to the environment that has been going to other users. And then sometimes streams or other aquatic ecosystems are simply dewatered and they don't get that water. So we're going to be digging into some of these methods and some ways to manage environmental water today. And for this study, we're going to California. So most people know where California is. It's in the west side of the United States. This map here on the right is showing the land area in kind of 5 equal areas by how much precipitation the state receives. So looking at this, the big takeaway is that some parts of the state are really wet, the mountain regions and more towards the north. Some parts of the state are really dry, especially Southern California and Central California. And then look where these cities are. A lot of our major cities in California aren't where we have much water. And along that same point, now I've honed in on the cities where you can see the population of California. So LA, San Francisco, Fresno, Sacramento are all in pretty dry places. So that means that we have to manage water to get water to those cities. On top of all of that, also, California is a major supplier of food and agricultural commodities. And so in the USA, about half of the nation's fruit, nuts, and vegetables come from California, and particularly the Central Valley, which you can see on this map, which is colored. What that means is that California has a huge and complex water supply system. It makes extensive use of reservoirs, of aqueducts, of groundwater. And so looking at this map is showing in circles where there are reservoirs. They're scaled by size. They're colored by who owns them, whether they're state or federal or local projects. The lines, the darker lines are showing conveyance through the state. And the point of this is just to say, yeah, there's a lot of infrastructure and a lot of management to manage water in California. And now I want to get into some of the environmental objectives that we might have. So a really, I would say, simple environmental objective, well, conceptually simple, is managing salmon, fish, trout, and salmon species. And so starting in the center of the screen, this is showing 4 runs of Chinook salmon, fall run, late fall run, winter, spring, and then steelhead. And these are all species that move from the ocean up into California rivers and streams. And I really like this figure in the middle. This is showing months on the bottom and their runs on the y-axis. And this is showing how all of these different runs have adapted to use rivers at different times. So rivers are always being used by some species, and they come and they go and they return up to spawning grounds, and they have their nests and they hatch babies, and then they go down to the ocean at different times of the year. So streams are always being used. Okay, so that brings me into what I call the paradox of reservoirs for environmental water management. So dams harm freshwater ecosystems. So thinking about the fish run timings that I showed in the previous slide, and looking at the map on the left here, this map is colored by places that fish, migratory fish can still access in blue, versus places that they can no longer access in red, because dams have been built to really physically block movement. So that's especially important thinking about climate change, where we have warming stream temperatures, and often our really nice cold water habitats are now blocked by reservoirs. So we know that dams harm freshwater ecosystems, and we have known this for decades. That is nothing new. On the right, I'm showing sometimes where we need dams to provide the environmental flows or the water quality necessary for aquatic ecosystems. And so here on the right side, sometimes we might have biological opinions, sometimes hydropower relicensing, different water board orders, water quality standards. And so these are all color coded by the places that we need dams to manage for the environment. And that's the paradox that we don't talk about very much. Mostly we say dams hurt ecosystems and we leave it there. And so with this research, I really want to push that a little bit farther to think, well, how could we use dams and reservoirs to better manage in the environment and aquatic ecosystems? So one problem is in California, we use a lot of regulations to manage environmental flows. So we might say things like minimum flows or environmental flows, like in April, streams should have at least, 1 cubic meter per second of water. So we have regulations that say things like that, or maybe manage water quality. The problem with that is it really treats the environment like a constraint, not like a priority. So other water users have water rights, they have priorities, they can buy and sell those rights, they could trade those rights, they could do all sorts of kind of creative water management. And the fact that environmental water is really a constraint on those things makes it tough to manage and completely inflexible. Also, regulations, we can't really change them easily. They often take years or decades to work their ways through legislation, meaning that if we have droughts or heat waves or other kind of crises that we need to react to, it's almost impossible. And here I'm with these pictures, I'm bringing up that these ideas, I've talked about fish, and I'm going to continue to talk about fish species in this paper, but this really applies to all ecosystems, from wetlands to riparian corridors to birds and other migratory species like that. All right. Now, on top of this, we have climate pressures that impact water management. And this is all water management, including environmental water management. Most of us know these already. So we have warming temperatures, of course, that causes shrinking snowpack. That in turn causes shorter wet seasons and longer dry seasons, or we sometimes think of also more volatile precipitation between and among years. And then places near coastlines, we also have rising sea level. So all of these stressors or pressures are also acting on our water management systems and our aquatic ecosystems. In California, droughts are intensifying. So this is showing anomalies, temperature anomalies through time for each year. So you can see that we moved into some cooler years, and now really every year, if this had kept going, every year is becoming hotter. And unfortunately, that's the trend that we're in. And then this is looking at runoff. So we have runoff on the y-axis. Again, this is the anomaly, so the departure from normal. And what you can see, especially in the last maybe 20 years for the Western US, is that we almost always have dry years punctuated by these very, very wet years. Those are tough to manage for. We really have no normal. If you look at this, we don't have a whole lot of small bars, a couple, but mostly we have these long bars with different extremes. And the recent future has been towards dry years. So what does this mean for water management? Well, here's the same reservoir a couple years apart. So this is Oroville Dam. This is a large reservoir and dam in California. The left picture shows 2017, which was a really wet year. The spillway was failing, and the state was working really hard to preserve the dam and to keep lives safe. So we had major flood control risk problems, a failing spillway, a failing emergency spillway. Fast forward 4 years, and here's the same reservoir in the midst of a drought. And here now at this point, we were trying to get through the year for water supply. So this is the reality of what those droughts and hydrological intensification means for water management. All right, and then now I'm kind of coming back here to environmental water management specifically. Because of the regulations, because this is all regulated flows, regulated water quality standards, it's not proactive to drought. So what I'm showing here in this figure is one single year, 2021, which was an extreme drought year. The blue line is showing reservoir inflow this is actually a composite of most of the state's major reservoirs. The red line is showing reservoir releases. So you can see we are in the midst of this drought, but still water managers were releasing much more water than was coming into the reservoir. And then the kind of goldish yellow line is reservoir storage. So this went on even though we knew that there wasn't a snowpack up in the mountains. We knew we weren't going to get this big pulse of reservoir inflow in the spring, and looking at that blue line, we didn't. It's really unique for California that there was no spring pulse. But still, managers were releasing water. So what happened as we got into May and June is a drought was declared, and then temperature standards were relaxed. Those are environmental standards to maintain cold water for things like trout and salmon. Finally, in almost July and late June, junior water rights were curtailed. That's where it says curtailment of post-1914 rights. That's a little California jargon. It means junior water right holders. And then finally, out almost to September, more senior water rights were curtailed. But before all of the curtailments, environmental water is the group that really took the hit, right? And so some of the challenges, now moving to the left side of the slide, again, is that the environmental regulations are constraints on the water systems. There's no water rights, there's no water right priorities. We usually operate our system with no room for error, right? We have so many competing uses for water, and water managers have a hard job. And so they kind of manage to the edge, right? And when something goes wrong, we don't have any slop or any slack in the system to be able to deal with it. And then these are regulatory rules like this are hard to change. So we can't just say, you know what, we don't have water in the reservoir, let's make a change. These things take years to work through the process. So what I want to look at now is thinking about how could we expand storage options for the environment, or would it do any good? So the new idea here that I just led into is thinking about storing water in surface reservoirs or groundwater aquifers to meet ecosystem objectives. So this is an idea that we don't do a whole lot of. There are very few reservoirs that have storage space, particularly, especially for environmental objectives. It would be an important idea because that water could be managed more flexibly. It could be managed more like other users where you could store water, you could keep it as carryover, you could trade water, you could do exchanges, things like that. It could, in other words, it could be managed. This would move us away from these kind of rule-based ecosystem or in-stream flows. Some of these ideas are very much at the forefront of California. For example, there was a proposition passed in California saying any new storage has to have benefits for the public. And one of those benefits, probably the major one, is environmental management. So all new storage in California has to have some sort of public benefit, and most commonly, that's environmental management, environmental water management. Okay, so some of the issues surrounding this idea is first infrastructure and hydrology, and that's what I'm going to be focusing this talk on today. There are other issues also, like governance and legal issues. And our team, this team that did the study, we had a number of lawyers, we had a number of water policy people. So we tried to address all of these components. I'm a hydrologist, and so I'm going to focus today's talk mostly on the infrastructure and the hydrology aspects. Okay, so what we wanted to do in this study is, I guess you could think of it very broadly as setting aside assets for the environment, where storage could be one of those assets. So we used a really simple reservoir model with a coupled reservoir temperature kind of model tied to it to evaluate the benefits and trade-offs of storing water for the environment and for ecosystems. So this study wasn't to look at every reservoir in California or every reservoir ever and say, is this feasible? But really to look at one place and say, does this idea have legs? Should we be looking at this? Okay, so what we did here was we coupled a water balance and a temperature model. The model the reservoir that we represented was 4.5 million acre feet. I apologize for those American imperial units. It's hard for me to think in millions of cubic meters still. This meant that the reservoir was really similar to Shasta Reservoir, which is California's largest reservoir. So that made it nice because we could take data from Shasta Reservoir and really have a lot of data ready to go. We used 26 years of hydrology on a monthly time step, and that was important because then we could evaluate the historical range of variability. In the reservoir itself, we had vertical temperature stratification. This is a reservoir that has temperature control devices, so managers can release water at specific temperatures if that temperature exists in the reservoir. We maintain things like flood rule curves, seasonal flood storage. So what this is, I guess, looks like is more stylized on the right here, where we have a reservoir with inflow coming in. Sometimes we have some flood storage from December to April, so we have to draw down the reservoir. The ecosystem might be able to store for environmental management maybe 10 to 40% of the flow of the total storage, and all other priorities could have the rest of the storage. We had 5 major demands that we modeled. The first was the environment, and I'll talk more about that in just a minute, our environmental objectives. The next was wildlife refuges. And I know some of you are thinking, well, why are wildlife refuges separate from environmental water management? And that's because in California, the refuges have water rights. So we separated those out. In-basin users, those are agricultural and urban users combined that have senior water rights. System water, if you guys haven't heard of system water, it means the water that we have to release to maintain salinity for urban and agricultural users, or sometimes so that diversion pumps will be submerged. So it's just the water that has to be released so that diversions can be made. Sometimes it has multiple uses and goes to other uses. Sometimes it just flows down the river. Without accounting for it, you get too much water in your model. And then we had exports. In this case, exports go to Southern California, and they're the only junior water use. So we assume that our new environmental water objectives and storage is senior water rights, just like refuges, other ag and urban is in-basin flows, and system water. Exports are junior water right holders. All right, so for environmental demands, we really wanted to focus on the environmental demands since that was really the focus of our studies. So we knew we wanted to include base flows and things that basically water that's already regulated, that we have rules and laws saying this water must be allocated. Those still have to be met. We cared a lot about temperature of reservoir releases because that's something we manage for in California. And then we added functional flows. So functional flows are bring in the idea of different pulses to help ecosystems. In California, functional flows have been described in most rivers. This river was one of them. And so on this figure on the right, the kind of tannish color is looking at a generic hydrograph and what it might have looked like with natural flows. The green is really the flows that we get below dams today. So we get maybe some water in the winter, maybe a little bit of a spring hump, and then really dry conditions into summer and fall. And then this gray area is where ecologists have described functional flows, and they're saying if you could just have a little bit of water for the environment, it would help to have a fall pulse flow to maybe turn over gravels so that fish migrating upstream can move gravels and make nests. Maybe a really wet season peak flow to connect the floodplain with the river channel and have vegetation recruitment, and then a spring recession flow, and that cues a lot of species to migrate and to move. All right, so these next few slides are going to go pretty quick. This is visualizing those three environmental objectives I just mentioned. So this first one showing in red are ecosystem flows that are regulated. So we have to provide these by law in the state. This next figure is a little bit stylized. This is showing in a reservoir the temperature of water and really how we manage it through the year. So the x-axis is months starting with October going through September, and the y-axis is reservoir storage. And the colors here are trying to show water temperatures. So this is showing as we move into winter, the water is really cold, right? We have a flood reserve for a while, so managers can't bring the reservoir all the way up to its maximum storage. Usually by about March or April, that flood reserve goes away and water managers can fill up the reservoir. The reservoir should be getting snowmelt in that season, so usually the reservoir is all cold water. Then irrigation season starts in May and June, April, May, and June, and we start to draw down the reservoir. And at the same time, we have the warm sun, and California is a nice, warm, dry place, warming the surface of the reservoir. So the reservoir starts to stratify. So we'll get really warm temperatures on the bottom, still usually with nice cold water at the bottom of the reservoir. So we get this stratification that I'm showing here, where we can move into thermal stress by the end of the water year into August and September. So we had some specific temperatures that we were trying to maintain from reservoir releases. And so these slight monthly differences, these are based on ecosystem needs specifically for salmon and trout. All right, and then we took that functional flows that I just showed you, and we just, instead of saying exactly when we would release them, we just said, here's a volume of water that managers can manage for a fall pulse, a spring recession, and a winter pulse. And so these are the functional flow objectives, and these three together make up our environmental objectives. So our model alternatives. First, we wanted to look at what I usually think of as bypass. So the idea of returning to natural flows is always front and center on people's minds. So we just said, what if we bypass through the reservoir maybe 10 to 40% of reservoir inflow, and that'll mimic natural flows. And this idea is an idea that always comes up in environmental flow management, is mimicking natural flows, because those are the flows that species have adapted to. So the second line says the same thing, 10 to 40% of flows are bypassed through the reservoir, but we also maintain a minimum reservoir storage level, and that's to preserve cold water. So 1.2 million acre feet of water we have to maintain that minimum reservoir storage level. And then these next, the third and the fourth row here get a little bit more interesting. So here is where we said, okay, we're going to give 10 to 40%. These are different runs. Some were 10, some were 20, whatever. 10 to 40% of inflow to the environment, but it could also be stored. We're also going to give 10 to 40% of storage for environmental objectives. And then we did that same run again where we constrained minimum flow. So we have 4 runs here that we're going to evaluate. All right, this figure here is a little complex, so I'm going to walk us through it. This is looking at our 3 environmental objectives. Let's see, our top 2 plots here have no minimum storage. The bottom 2 have a minimum, that cold water storage minimum constraint. These 2 left plots here have water storage and flow. No, excuse me, these left 2 have just bypass, and the right have the inflow and the storage. And then we have environmental base flow is always this kind of light blue color, stream temperatures or reservoir release temperatures always this greenish color, and functional flows are always this blue. And this is saying, like, if we give 10% of inflow to bypass, if we give 20%, 30%, 40%, the y-axis is the percentage of time that environmental objectives are met. So what I want you to take from this is when we have bypass, so mimicking natural flows, we have these trade-offs among environmental objectives where the more flow we release for downstream ecosystems, the worse we do on our stream temperature objectives. So that we start to release more water, and really what happens is the reservoir gets drawn down, and we also start to release a lot of warm water. When we add an environmental water budget where we can store water and sometimes carry it over through different seasons or different years, I wouldn't say that the trade-off with stream temperature totally goes away, but it really flattens out. So at the top, when there's no minimum environmental storage constraint, it flattens out after about 20%, 20, 30, 40. And once we constrain reservoir storage, it really flattens out completely. But as you add more flow, you know, we start to get pretty good environmental benefits from functional flows and base flow releases. So the take-home message for this are there are trade-offs among environmental objectives. Carryover storage for the environment is really important because it allows all of our environmental objectives to perform the best. And then we know that we need temperature management for salmon and steelhead. So we can't really just ignore and look only at flows, at least not in a place like California. And then this figure, I'm going to really try to dive into these same ideas, but here I'm showing 3 years that were all drought years. Water year 2019 through 2021, 3 years of progressive drought. So these left panels show pass-through, so no reservoir storage. There was a cold pool, a minimum reservoir storage constraint. And then the right figures all show a percentage of inflow for the environment, a storage space for the environment, and that minimum storage constraint to manage temperature. So these are showing the minimum storage constraint in blue for both options, storage for all the other demands. Here on this right side, when we have storage for the environment, we have storage for other demands, plus the environmental storage, where we can see that sometimes, yes, it is used for carryover. And then this blue line is showing the volume of the water in the reservoir that's less than 12 degrees Celsius. And you can see that over here where we have storage, that we really, we're much better able to maintain this into our 3rd year of drought. This next plot C and D are showing environmental base flows delivered only in the version with bypass, when we're not actually managing that water, we're just passing it through a reservoir. We start to get shortages in all years for environmental base flows. And this really mimics how these have been in real life. In all of these years, environmental regulatory standards had to be released or had to be relaxed during drought. But if we were to store water, that might not be the case, if we were to allow the environment to store some water. And then now this is the functional flow. So these kind of get the later priority. If there's enough water to deliver the base flows, then we move on to functional flows. With bypass, we always have shortages. When we store water for the environment, we don't really end up with shortages until the last few years, a little bit in year 2, and then year 3, we start to be running out of water. All right, so now what are the trade-offs with the other demands? Because just looking at environmental objectives isn't really fair. We also want to say, well, what happened to other senior and junior water users? So these are the same kind of setup as before, where we have bypass in these left 2 figures. These right 2 figures have a proportion of inflow and storage, and then the bottom figures are also constrained by minimum storage in the reservoir. All of these darker lines are the senior water uses for refuges, in-basin, and system water, and the export are the junior users. And what really sticks out to me in these figures is there are major trade-offs, especially for junior water right holders. And that makes sense, right? If we're adding in some other priorities and giving them senior priority, the junior priorities really take a big hit. So now I'm plotting up, the temperature isn't on here, but I'm plotting up the trade-offs between ecosystem or environmental objectives and other water supply objectives. So on the x-axis, I have environmental water budget or environmental demands. This is base flow and our functional flows. And on the y-axis, I have all other objectives. So in-basin, out-of-basin, junior and senior priorities. These lines are showing the kind of warm, reddish, pinkish colors are showing pass-through or pass-through with cold water pool storage. And the blue figures here are showing when we have inflow and storage, or the dark blue is inflow and storage and minimum flows for cold water storage. And then these colors of the dots are moving from 10% of water for the environment or 10% of water and storage. And as they get darker, we move up to 40%. So what these show to me is that, first of all, with how things were, we don't really start before 10%, but even with 10% of flows for the environment, almost all of the shortages went to the environment, right? And the other demands were mostly getting their water in most years. And then another really interesting thing I think is first of all, we see these bluer curves where we have inflow and storage really push up where we're getting a lot more benefit. And at about 30% of flows, we have a knee or a break point in our trade-off curve, right? And so this is saying maybe not in all systems, but at least in this system, probably 30% of water for the environment and 30% of storage seems like a pretty good place. After that, we start getting really steep increases in shortages for other users, for ag and urban users. This is a quick figure showing the volume of water 12 degrees Celsius or less in the reservoir through time. So this is a monthly plot, but you can see years on the x-axis, the water volume on the y-axis, and the light colors are showing inflow pass. The light colors are showing 10% inflow pass through. The darker tan is 40% pass through. And down here where we have reservoir storage, you can see that we really increase the volume of water that's less than 12 degrees Celsius. And that's important to meet our downstream temperature control objectives. All right, so now I want to talk a little bit about this idea, I guess, more broadly. So getting into governance and administration. So this is where, you know, it's easy to think, okay, these are ideas from an academic. How would this really look? And this is where our policy people and the lawyers really helped a good deal with this research, as they dug a lot into the literature and the legal framework, and they said, you know, there's a number of approaches. One, dam operators could be the ones to manage for this, and we would be adding more objectives. There are some limitations there. Dam operators already have a lot to work on. They might not actually know that much about ecosystems. So it could also fall to regulators. So things like state agencies or federal agencies that already are managing the environment. And then there's some precedents to what we're calling having an independent trustee. And so in one basin in California, the San Joaquin River, after years of litigation, a restoration administrator was set up where for this reservoir, there's basically a restoration administrator who helps design releases. And they have a proportion of storage even that they could use in Friant Dam as shown here. So there's some precedents already for these ideas in California. Now, this work could tie in and dovetail to a lot of the policy and the infrastructure questions that are happening in the state. So environmental flows are being designed for most rivers. They're not necessarily being implemented, but they're at least being described, where they're saying, here are the environmental flows that would be really helpful for the ecosystem. They don't always have a lot of flexibility in those. Voluntary agreements are pushed throughout the state and throughout the western states. So if any of you guys have paying attention to, say, Colorado River issues, the federal government is trying to step out of day-to-day management, and they're saying, okay, all water users, you work together to all use less water. And how you do it, we don't care about, but by the end of a few months, we want you to have a plan, right, to use less water and to figure out who will take shortages. And so with this whole idea of voluntary agreements above users, this is another nice place where this idea could come in. There are always water quality control plans and updates to those plans specifying the water quality standards that have to be met or maintained in California's rivers. And then there are always long-term operations and operational agreements between the federal water project and the state water project. So it's ongoing kind of flexibility and coordinated management of the water system. And then finally, coming back to Proposition 1, so the state has invested a lot of money into storage space for California, where the state is saying we will match funds for any new storage, but some of that storage has to be used for public benefit, including environmental objectives. And here I picked for this study kind of a hard case because I used surface storage. There's a lot of underground storage because in the state of like most of the Western United States, we've really drawn down our aquifers. So there are easier and cheaper places to be able to get some storage space. And I picked a hard way to demonstrate this idea. If it could work in surface storage, I think it's safe to say it could also work in groundwater storage. Okay, so what are some of the big takeaway messages if you've tuned out for the last half hour? First is that there's a paradox of dams and that they harm the environment, but we also rely on them to manage water for the environment. This is particularly true in a changing future with climate change and with hydroclimate variability. Allocating a portion of inflow and storage did a better job than trying to mimic natural flows. And it also did a better job than the regulatory approach that we currently use. So this to me has a lot of promise, right? It's easy for people to say, oh, we should just manage environmental flows and give a proportion of natural flows. And we've shown that that doesn't actually work the best. But to do this idea, having more storage, we might need to build more storage, use underground storage, and often coordinate and work together with other groups. And that's difficult. Along those lines, good governance is needed here. These concepts apply to most planning and regulatory efforts in California, the Western states in the US, and elsewhere in the world. And then storing water for the environment is a really promising adaptation during drought. So far we've been trying to manage our rivers like they were 100 years ago, and that's not always working for fish. We need some more, and other aquatic species. We need some more flexible management approaches. This study has been published, so if anyone's interested in taking a look at it, it's in Nature Communications, it's open access, so anyone can grab a copy of it. There's the citation and what it looks like. And then we've also written a report more for lay audiences, water managers, environmental water managers. That's open source, so that was done with the Public Policy Institute of California's Water Policy Center. There's a 2-page policy brief also, so if you go, I like these ideas, but I want the 2-page version, not the 30-page version, we've got you covered there. That's usually what I look for. And then this work took a whole group of folks. I was the hydrologist, like I said, we had water lawyers and ecologists and water policy folks and other engineers. And so we had a whole big group of us working on this, and this is my team. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. Let's start with this. No, leave this your thank you page. Let's start from there, Sarah.
Okay.
You covered your face with a face cap in that pic. That didn't do good justice to you. Please, next time, use a picture where we can see your face so well. Thanks so much for the very, very, very educative, and it's quite an insight. I'm also still struggling to take everything in, but very quickly, I see that you gave an articulate argument towards the fact that storing water for the environment is a promising adaptation for drought intensification. That's timely, and quite impressive from where the work started, and eventually we could draw, such a conclusion. My first reaction is, has any of these been taken in real time in California?
I'm just going to repeat that. Was your question that has any of these ideas been undertaken, or have we talked to people about these ideas?
Yes, pretty much.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Yes and yes. So we had the group of us that you can see here on the screen. We held a number of workshops with, I guess I'll loosely call them water managers, but actually we separated them out. And so in some workshops, we had like dam operators. In some, we had environmental managers. In some, and NGOs. In some, we had agricultural users very specifically. And then in some, we had, I would say more like legal experts, or maybe water rights, the folks at the Water Rights Agency. And so we had a number of workshops. Most of them were, I would say they were pretty upbeat about this, with the exception sometimes we showed, like here are junior water rights that would have considerable cutbacks. And certainly I remember some people who managed water contractors for the state going, oh my gosh, that slide would be really hard for me to manage for. But overall, these ideas people took them really promising. And then there is, like I mentioned, there is some precedence with this idea. And this was interesting because it's not really in the academic literature. It was the result of litigation in the state. And one result was that an environmental manager was basically created, and they get some storage and they get some releases, and they have to manage all environmental objectives. And so that was neat to kind of find that example. Future examples might be coming with this new proposition in California that requires future storage to have public benefits.
Okay, because my own experience around this, I remember when the World Health Organization, started these water safety plans and all that, and I had to undertake a study on what can actually drive, the implementation and adoption across board. Eventually, one of the things that jumped out is target the regulators. If you get the buy-in of the regulators, they can find figure out how to, ensure compliance and things like that. All right. There's this question. I don't know if you can also see it on your side. Alex is asking, are environmental water levels a consideration as well? He's thinking about shoreline bird habitats like piping plover. I hope I pronounced that correctly. This is an issue on the Gardiner Dam in Saskatchewan during certain times of years. So what's your take on that?
I would say that's a great question. And the focus that I did, we focused on salmon species because they're listed as endangered or threatened species, and because we know a lot about them. But we didn't need to. We could, for example, say, here are species like a species of plover, especially if we understand their habitat needs as it relates to water management. Like, what are the depths of water they need? What's the timing? Then that's really easy to put into frameworks just like this one. And so I guess my shorter answer is, if we understand their habitat requirements, we can incorporate them in pretty easily.
Okay, thank you. Another question that comes to mind is, you have a lot of data that you can work with in California. Can this be applied in data scarce regions, for instance?
That is an excellent question, because you're right that California and the Western US has a ton of data, and other places that's not the case. Right now I'm sitting in Argentina, where just finding streamflow data is really hard to come by. And so I guess usually when I've worked in outside of the US or outside of Europe in other systems, people know a good deal about the systems, but just grabbing streamflow and things and temperatures, and it's just not so straightforward. So I guess there is some of this modeling probably comes down to being in a very data rich environment. And I guess my hope is that other countries might learn from some of the mistakes that we've made in the US of building dams on every single river and expecting there to be no environmental consequences to that.
Well, I think what they're learning is to actually build dams on every river. They're not at that point where they're learning from that mistake. The floor is open. Any other question, Kevin?
Yeah, well done, Sarah, as usual. Still remember your inspiring study, which was related to a dam removal discussion also, right? Back in, I wonder if it was 2004 or 5 that you had that very impressive study. Was it 2004?
It was, yes, that's when I finished the study. The paper was published in 2006. And you're referring to I did a study about the implications of removing Hetch Hetchy Dam, which is or Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, which is a dam in Yosemite National Park in California. So it's a place that we have since the dam was built, we have since set aside for conservation and recreation. Yeah.
So speaking of that the dam removal discussion, and based on your observations or the research results, we tend to believe that dam removals are good for the environment, although the experience we have with dam removals is very limited. We don't know how ecosystem reacts. So now here's a tricky, a controversial question to you. Is it better to start with the idea of removing dams or operating the existing dams for the environment?
I think both have a place. And so with this study, we went into it thinking, is dam removal a better option? And it quickly became clear, thinking about that paradox of dams, that we can't, maybe some dams we could remove, like in the Klamath Basin in California and Oregon, 4 major dams are coming out, and this is really unprecedented. But that's not the case for everywhere. For example, this example reservoirs I used in California, Shasta Reservoir, I can't imagine any circumstances where that dam would come out. And so it quickly became apparent that dam removal is sometimes a promising idea, but often it's not. And when it's not, how can we do better? So I guess that was some of the premise of where we started this study.
And I would add that the size of the dams matter, right? So that's the other issue. And I was involved in a study a few years ago, and there have been also other publications that show that even the dam removal decisions have never been made solely for the purpose of helping the environment, although environmentalists celebrate that enough, they can. But you often have the other issues like safety, maintenance cost, and so on. So there is this is more of a question. I'm now making it into a comment, but do we know the response do we have enough information about the response of nature to dam removal? Because nature has adapted itself to an upstream infrastructure. And now we tend to think if we preserve, preservation of environment or conservation is returning to the status quo, but the status quo has itself changed, and who knows how the dam would, the ecosystem would react to the sediments and all those, new things that would happen. So do we have enough information to be assured that dam removal is good for the environment?
Well, I guess this is almost, I feel like I planted this question for somebody to ask me in this audience. So I'm doing a separate study on dam removal, on whether dam removal is a appropriate response for climate resilience. And that study is not completed yet, so maybe I can give another one of these talks in 6 months or a year when I expect it to be done. But we're finding that often it is an important climate adaptation, but sometimes it's really not. And I guess some of the caveats that I think you were alluding to, often dam removal is not done purely for environmental reasons. It might have costs or engineering concerns. And those are important, especially with climate resilience, when our hydrology is starting to become outside of the range that some of our infrastructure was built for. So we have floods that are different magnitudes, and maybe our existing infrastructure can't withstand those sorts of floods or magnitudes. And then there are some places that are very obviously, no, we can. At some stage, having storage and having flood protection is also a climate adaptation. And so we're really finding this kind of diversion of results in a very interesting way for dam removal.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Excellent seminar. What is the situation in other US states about allocating water for environmental purposes? Are there studies, they are doing some studies, or there is some work on the ground happening?
Yeah, I would say in the Western US, there's usually a regulatory approach, which is what I talked about here, or now I live in Utah. When I'm not in Argentina, I live in Utah. And Utah really wants no regulation at all, and they're using a market approach. So they're trying to reallocate water from voluntary sellers to environmental places. And so that's a really different approach, has different challenges and different opportunities. And then in the eastern portion of the US, shortages are shared. And so there's a different type of water rights there called riparian water rights. Although that being said, I guess with climate change, we're starting to get into larger and larger shortages on the East Coast, but they're usually kind of pale in comparison to the major water shortages that we have on the West Coast or in the Western states.
Okay.
Hi, Sara. Thanks for a very interesting work. So I'm coming back to the paradox that you are putting in, like natural flow versus managed flow. But then when you decide what would be the flow required or should be the good for species, so then there would be question for what are the species that you are managing for. And there could be a kind of contentious, especially when the river is long and is a transboundary. So then these questions will be very difficult to address in that sense. So what would be your response to that?
I would say, yes, you are correct. If we were to do this on a transboundary river, everything would be much more complicated and might require a compact or an update to a compact. And those are easy to say and very, very hard to do. In Utah, where I live now, we're using water markets to try to maintain water in natural places, and we almost always think of the water that originates in Utah and doesn't leave the state, or once it's left the state, once it comes back. And that's important because Utah has two major compacts, the Colorado River Compact and also the Bear River Compact. So a lot of our water is actually managed in conjunction with other states, and it makes it slow and it makes it complicated. And sometimes I think some options are just off the table.
Okay, thank you.
Interesting. Miriam.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is really interesting. And you were talking about how allocating inflow and storage did better, both in the mimicking the natural flows and also the traditional regulatory approach. And I'm wondering if this performed better from an equity perspective as well. If you looked at like the Cal Enviro screen or any other indicators, and if allocating inflow also led to a more sort of socially equitable distribution of water.
That's a great question. And we didn't look at that. And I would be interested to look at that. We weren't, I guess my take is that in a system like California, where water rights really, I would say, have no tie to equity, and they can make some very unjust outcomes, where environmental water management might be one of them, but it's not the only one. And yeah, that's a really interesting idea that somebody should follow up on. I or somebody else should follow up on.
Okay, so we could collaborate on that, isn't it?
One more presentation for you down the road.
Oh my. Oh, it's been very interesting. We have barely 2 minutes or thereabout, so except you want to throw a question, to us too, this is where we want to call it a wrap. I know you've shared your contact, so I'm sure if there are more reactions, I would be happy to push them to you. But it's so nice to see your face. It's been an interesting time, listening to you. It's the insight is quite valuable. We appreciate it. And like Kavi said, we look forward to another yet interesting presentation. You said 6 months, isn't it? So I'll hold you to that. Thank you so much. Take care now. Bye.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
Sarah. Thank you.